Okay, so as I mentioned before, we're going to take a turn this week and talk about some different issues. We've talked about how resources ought to be distributed and where rights come in within a political community, but we really haven't talked about what the scope of the political community ought to be. As has come up in discussion, a lot of the writers we've looked at, especially in the theoretical sections, have assumed that the scope of the political community is basically something like the nation state. But as some of you noticed, there's a real pressure in these theories to say, no, why should we care about how things go on within the nation state and not across the whole globe? Or, we only know of people on the globe, but, any rational beings. This is the same pressure that makes a lot of people think, well, why shouldn't we include animals, say, in the scope of what is the community? So I'd like to start the discussion of sort of how the political community is demarcated and how it should be organized and interact with other political communities by talking about, on the global scale, one of the most salient ways it comes up in our world, which is the question of whether or not some kind of nationalism, some kind of favoring our own co-nationals over others could possibly be morally justified, or if morality demands that we think of things from a purely cosmopolitan perspective, that we consider national borders of no importance, and people are people wherever they are as far as our moral decision making ought to go. Okay, so big issues. Most moral theories in their bare outlines are pretty universalist. You'll notice that when we talk about utilitarianism, right, we talk about well-being of people. We don't talk about their nationality. The whole each person counts for one and none for more than one attitude of utilitarianism would be violated if we said, well, when Americans make decisions, Americans count for two, not for one. Similar thing with other kinds of theories. Rawlsian theory, part of the reason why, even though Rawls restricted his theory to the one political community, something like a nation state, what he calls a people, there's a lot of reason why followers of his like Bites and Pogge have said, why would you even do that, right? Why wouldn't we do a global contract, right? The same way that the way things are within a nation state should be reasonable to the least well off. Why shouldn't the fact that, the nation state system globally is set up the way it is be reasonable to the people least well off in that system? And then, of course, for libertarians, right? I mean, this is another way in which libertarianism borders on certain kinds of anarchism. For a libertarian, it's very hard to see from the basic premises of libertarianism why we would say, well, within the state, everything should be voluntary associations, no force and fraud, no forced redistribution. But, outside the state, whatever, right? Cheat and steal and lie and conquer to people outside your country. It doesn't matter, right? It's not clear what in the libertarian premises could possibly justify that kind of attitude. On the flip side, almost everyone favors certain kinds of people who are closer to them. We morally favor people in our community. We morally favor our co-nationals. We morally favor our family. And this does not seem to be a sort of weakness of will, right? We don't normally think of the fact that people tend to favor their own families in their decision-making as, well, really, if you were a moral saint, you would treat everyone equally. But, because we are fallen, limited creatures, we focus on our family. No, quite the opposite, in fact. Someone who did not give any moral preference to members of their own family would seem like a moral monster to a lot of us, or at least deeply weird. Bernard Williams has this very famous example that he he illustrates what he calls the one thought too many problem that comes up, especially with utilitarian theories. So he says, look, imagine that your wife, husband, partner, whatever, was trapped in a burning building. Imagine that my wife was trapped in a burning building. There's also another person trapped in the burning building. Right? I rush in and I save my wife. And somebody says, well, look, why'd you save your wife from the burning building, not the other person? Now, a utilitarian could tell a story about this, right? A utilitarian could say, well, look, as it turns out, most of the time, if we focus on the good of the people who are closest to us, who we know better, it will turn out that we are promoting the overall good more efficiently than if we just try to help everyone neutrally, because we often don't know how to help people who are distant. I live with my wife, I know a lot about her preferences. Okay, while I'm talking, Bernard Williams thinks, right, while I'm talking, my wife should be filing divorce papers, right? Well, not my wife. My wife would say, look, he's a philosopher, what do you expect? He quoted Aristotle when he proposed. But a normal person's wife would be very angry at this turn of events, right? The right answer, the answer that most of us would find acceptable is something like, well, I saved her because she's my wife, not because I'm instrumentally serving the greater good. So Williams thinks that universalist theories, and a lot of people have this intuition, that purely cosmopolitan, purely universalist theories, where the particular connections that you have with other people don't make any difference, they just violate some of our most fundamental moral intuitions. And on the political level, part of the way this question comes up is we have an important notion of a political community. The idea that I have a special relationship to other Americans that I don't have to Canadians. That some of you who are from other countries have a special relationship to Argentinians or Chinese or Ecuadorians or Nepalese that you don't have to other people from other countries. And this goes beyond any kind of similarity or any kind of contractual relationship. It's just inherent to the notion of there being a community. And one of the questions for most universalist moral theories, and for many moral theories, is, can we get this idea of political community out of morality that basically focuses on individuals? Or do we need some kind of moral theory that is inherently non-individualistic or supra-individualistic? All right. So let's think about what could justify nationalism. I set up the sort of question of how it seems that you can't justify nationalism on the grounds of most moral theories. Care ethics might be an exception. But given the fact that many of us have deep moral intuitions that communities are important, people close to us are important, and that there is something meaningful, morally meaningful about the nation state, can we come up with some kind of theory that would explain this? And there are really, and there's probably a million different ways people have talked about this, but there are really three big ways that people have tried to justify this. The first is, and the sort of the most liberal kind of way of doing it, is to say, look, states are kind of like voluntary associations. We are in a kind of pseudo-contract with other members of our state, and we are not in the same kind of pseudo-contract across state borders. A different kind of version of this would be to say that we have a deeper interaction with people within our state than we do with people across state borders. This is, on the face of it, fairly plausible way of understanding what's special about the state, but it has really two problems. If you think of the state as a pseudo-contract, then you just raise the question that people like Pogge pose to Rawls, right? Why should we make a contract only in the state and not in the globe? And since we're not talking about an actual contract, right? None of us sat down and said, at least past the, well, I meant none of us. Almost all of us who have not served in the military have not sat down and said explicitly, I promise to serve the interests of the United States. or I promise to serve the interests of Bangladesh, right, above all others. So when we're talking about hypothetical contracts anyway, why should we think of them as being limited to a state? The second kind of problem with this is if you think of it as a contract to say, well, look, we can't, immoral contracts are typically not valid, right? If I promise to murder someone, you would not think that it was moral for me to keep that promise just because I promised it, right? It's the kind of promise I ought not make. So if, in fact, nationalism is morally unjustified, then making a contract among the, to serve the interests of your nation above other nations would be morally unjustified and couldn't be binding, right? So it begs the question. And if you think about it as having to do with interactions, this is the way Rawls kind of thought about it. The problem is, maybe that made sense, probably didn't make sense ever, right? Maybe that made sense in a much more divided world, but especially in our current globalized world, it's often not true, right? I have closer interactions with some people in Ghana than I do with most people in Montana. I have, the clothes on my back are mostly made outside of the United States. I have pretty important relationships with people all around the world, and it does not seem like the relationships stop or the interactions, the influences stop in a morally important way, all and only at the borders of the country. Okay. The second kind of way would be the sort of burning building utilitarianism way, to say we're better situated to help co-nationals, so everyone's better off if we charity starts at home. There's something to this, but again, first of all, this would suffer from the one thought too many problem, potentially, right? If this is the way I explain my nationalism to someone who's very patriotic, they probably will not find it to be a completely satisfying explanation, right? On the other hand, it also suffers from a version of the kind of globalization problem. I don't know that much about people who live in Montana. I don't think I know anyone from Montana, right? So why should I, by virtue of being born in America, think of myself as better situated to help co-nationals, rather than just better situated to help the people I happen to have some kind of connection with? Okay. And the last, and in a lot of ways the theoretically deepest way of trying to justify nationalism would be to say, look, universalism relies on this very naive picture of what life is like, and particularly of what human moral psychology is like. It relies on the image of all of us as freestanding, self-contained, autonomous individuals who make our lives meaningful just by choosing what we value and going after that. And that's just not the way humans operate. So we need to build community itself essentially into our moral theories. Otherwise, we miss something important about the moral terrain. Communities are not just individuals who happen to come together because they want to. In a lot of ways, community is prior to individualism. You can't become a full individual unless you have a community background. This is the communitarian challenge. This is sort of the deepest theoretical challenge to the liberal picture that makes nationalism seem hard to justify. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about this naivete of these potential naivete of liberalism, right? And remember, liberalism includes both liberal egalitarian and libertarian theories. And in a lot of ways, utilitarianism, because it's focused on sort of what you prefer, you individual, and just summing up across them, is vulnerable to this kind of critique, even though it is not strictly a liberal theory. So, as I mentioned, the two first premises of this, liberalism is individualist, makes the individual the core of political morality. The value of groups can only be the value of those groups to the individuals in them. But critics will say, look, individual freedom doesn't mean anything outside of a social context, right? Think of all of the things, for instance, that you might want to do with your life. most of these, it's not just that you couldn't do them without help from other individuals. It's that they literally don't make sense except against the background of a social context. So for instance, I'm a professor of public policy. It's not just that I need other people to help me do this. It's that if we imagine that I am outside society in some way, that whole role just literally doesn't make sense, right? It wouldn't make any sense to, if I lived on a desert island, to say, oh, I'm a professor of public policy, right? It's not, it wouldn't be just that I failed to do it. It would be that it does not make sense. The same way that I, living in 21st century America, cannot be a samurai, right? I can go buy armor, I can learn Japanese, I can get myself cool swords. Nothing I can do can make me a samurai. It just does not make sense in my social context. Roles are like this, but think of all the other kinds of things that require social context to support them. I can biologically have a child outside of a society, but I can't really be a father in a meaningful way. Father is this thing that comes with all sorts of social baggage, right? I can't even own things outside of society, right? What would it mean to say that you can talk about me having something in the sense of having physical control of it, but you can't talk about me owning a house outside of a society. So there's very limited options. Most of the space of options for even what you want to do with your freedom are constructed by the groups that you live in. Okay, so if you try to think of, the argument basically goes like this. If you try to think of the state as a way of just allowing individuals to pursue their own voluntary good, you completely mistake the nature of what's going on. Individuals don't have goods outside of some kind of framework, some kind of social structure. And if the state refuses to support a social structure, it's not going to help people be free. It's not going to help them have actual options that make sense to them. So the argument goes, on the state level, the idea that states are just there to keep people out of each other's way is naive. States need to support this framework if they're going to actually have free individuals who are parts of them. So states have a right and an obligation to promote a particular kind of social concept of the good, not just individual choice. There's not necessarily one unique concept of the good that states have to support, but they have to support some kind of framework in which individual choices make sense. Whether that is a framework that says, you know, consumerism and free markets are wonderful, that gives us certain kinds of meaningful choices, or all of us are children of God who should respect the theocracy, that gives a different set of meaningful choices. But the idea that you can just have a group of people with no framework who make choices is a naive picture of how the state should work. On a more instrumental level, critics of liberalism will say, look, only in a community, this is the moral psychology point, only in a community will individuals feel the force of considerations of justice. It's all well and good for me to say in the abstract, oh, I have an obligation to help out people who are less fortunate than me. But people won't actually do those things unless they feel a sense of community. The argument is that I will only be willing to help out people less fortunate than me if I see them as, in some fundamental sense, one of us. And this argument, we can talk about this more, there's been some research, and this argument is, this kind of phenomenon is often sort of the theoretical basis, well, sorry, constructed my sentence wrong. Many political scientists have argued that this is part of why European countries have much more redistributive welfare state social safety net systems than America, because they tend to have stronger, more cohesive cultural identities. Whereas in the United States, for instance, discussions about welfare and redistribution are almost inevitably racialized to some extent. when we discuss welfare in the United States, it is very hard not to have creep into the conversation the fact that poverty in the United States tends to be disproportionately concentrated among African Americans, Latinos, and other racial minorities. And they have done psychological. This is not just like accusing people of being horrible racists, right? This often is below the level of conscious prejudice. But they've done research on things like, they ask people, imagine a drug dealer, right? Tell me what you think they look like, right? So imagine him and then tell me what he looks like in your head. And most people will describe most Americans will describe in these studies sort of a stereotypical, gangsta rap African-American young man. Statistically, it turns out most drug dealers are white. They mostly live in the suburbs, because it's a different kind of thing. Nonetheless, that's the image. So in that kind of context, even if I am not consciously racist, there's a sub-level where it's very easy for me to say, well, I don't want to spend more taxes on welfare. That's not helping us. That's helping them, right? Whereas in European countries, the idea is that people see the other co-nationalists as more like us, right? Now, this also has an ugly side. You see, in a lot of ways, even stronger kind of xenophobia and backlash against immigrants and Muslims and that sort of thing in a lot of European countries than you see in the U.S. But the idea is that you can't have the good without the bad, right? The liberal ideal is sort of we all love each other equally. The communitarian critique is saying, no, you can't really do that. You have to have a society that has a kind of us versus them divide if you want to get people to care about the us. There's no way to make the entire globe us, right? You need a them, is sort of the critique of the psychology. Okay. So, here's how communitarians, right? Folks, if you're really convinced that liberalism is naive, liberalism is too individualistic, it doesn't take enough account of the importance of social structures and cultural and communal structures to people's freedom, it doesn't take enough account of how actual human moral psychology works, you may be attracted to communitarian theories. Communitarian theories are ones that say the community has, in a lot of ways, a primary moral significance. And there are lots of variations on communitarianism, but what binds them together is the idea that in some ways, in some cases, the health and interests of the community can take precedence over the health and interests of the individual, precisely because the individual cannot be a full moral individual without that community. The community is prior. So communitarians have a slightly different picture, and one that much more easily supports a kind of nationalism. Whereas liberals typically think of states as formed to kind of allow us to engage in joint projects while keeping out of each other's ways, communitarianism is happier to say, no, the state should take itself to be developed to promote justice, to promote the good, to promote people being good, right? The community can take a hand in making sure that we are good people by the lights of that community. So communitarians, for instance, will be much more friendly to what in the United States context is considered a kind of social conservatism. Not all communitarians are conservative. Many conservatives in that sense are communitarian. But this idea that, no, it shouldn't be that you get to do whatever you want, right? Because that undermines the cohesiveness, the sort of the community of values that we have. There should be a way that the family looks, because the family is a moral unit of society, and we need to have a cohesive background where we know what a family is, we know what a family role is, right? That's a very communitarian kind of idea. There, of course, are plenty of more left-leaning kinds of communitarians. Marxists are typically some kind of communitarian. They are not really liberals, right? But they see the emancipation of this very rough caricature, right? But they see the emancipation of the class of workers as more important than the fate of any individual worker or the choices of any individual worker, precisely because they think that without emancipation of the class, the freedom of individual workers is essentially devalued, right? The freedom is the freedom to choose Coke over Pepsi. It's not a freedom to live sort of a fully moral life, right? So there are both right-wing and left-wing versions of this. In the American context, more associated with the right wing. Globally, where various forms of full-blooded socialism are more live options, there are a lot more left-wing versions of communitarianism. Okay, so state is there to promote justice. Justice requires a moral community, so it makes sense for the state to promote a particular vision of community. And there is no moral communitarians who are nationalists, right? Not all of them are nationalists, right? Marxists are sort of cosmopolitan communitarians, right? But communitarians who are nationalists will say there's no moral community between states. And a very typical way of arguing for this is just, look, it's too big, right? Lots of communitarians, Alistair McIntyre, prominent example of this, thinks that even the modern nation state is too big. There's no proper moral community. Our political units should be about the size of Greek city-states, right? A few tens of thousands of people, where you won't know everyone personally, but you'll probably have seen everyone on the street at some point, right? A city is maybe about the biggest size of unit that you can have a proper moral community in, where things like justice make sense. But even communitarians who are willing to allow it to be larger say, look, the modern nation state is probably about the largest unit that we can have. It's already pretty stretched to talk about the moral community that I have with people from Montana in a large state like the United States. Talking about me having a single moral community with everyone on the globe is just nonsense. I could say it, but it's not going to be true. I'm not going to feel the kinds of links to people that would be required. And importantly, to have a community, a commitment to sort of abstract morality or just the bare idea of national identity is not sufficient, right? It's not enough for me to say, oh, I'm an American, and Americans believe in morality, right? There's going to be a thicker community, both in terms of what I'm willing to do for other Americans and also in terms of things like rituals and festivals and that sort of thing that will bind our communal sense together, right? This is why a lot of, again, not all, but a lot of communitarians are big fans of things like state religions, right? If there's a state religion, it's not just that we're all bound together by, if Christianity were the state religion of the United States, it wouldn't be just that we're all bound together by, belief that Jesus is the Savior. It would be that, we all go to Mass every Sunday, right? We all participate in the same festivals, right? I mean, think of the role that Christmas plays as a kind of unifying secular festival in the United States, right? Be amped up if we had, every month there was some kind of festival that we all went to, right? If the church was a basic unit of social capital, right? All of these things would help the communitarians say, bind us more together as a political community. And in fact, even a lot of non-communitarians have essentially wanted to say, look, we kind of need some kind of secular religion, right, to play this kind of role that religion is really good at. Okay. And basically what this all sums up to is when you think about how you would actually try to build a nation state, a moral community, you would realize that you have to give the nation moral primacy over both everyone outside of it and over any individual within it, right? You're not going to sacrifice individuals, but ultimately the good of the community comes before the good of any particular individual within it, right? So if somebody wants to, communitarians are typically, for instance, not big fans of unrestricted freedom of speech. Right. So if somebody wants to spew, blasphemy against the state religion, communitarians will often say, yeah, well, there's the state would be reasonable in stopping them from doing that. We can talk a bit about sort of tolerated minorities and that sort of thing later, but that's the core. Okay. Liberals will not take this lying down. Liberals have in recent years, Kimlicka among them, recognize that the communitarians have a point about some of the naivety of classical liberalism. That, yeah, liberalism is this kind of thin theory that doesn't take into account limited sympathies, doesn't take into account the importance of identity as opposed to just sort of voluntary association. And so some liberals have tried to come up with a concept of moral community and even nationalism that makes sense from a liberal framework, because they're not willing to go as far as the communitarians and say the community is sort of morally more important than the individual, but they are willing to say, okay, yeah, you guys are right. American or Jew or, woman or whatever, these are not just groups that you happen to join up with. They're identity constituting that sort of make your life make sense. So liberals say, look, what we have to stick to be liberals is to keep the state neutral about conceptions of the good life. The state, you're not a liberal anymore if you think the state should be telling people what a good human life looks like in great detail. Okay. Some liberals will say, but, this doesn't imply that you can't impose cultural rules for instrumental reasons, right? So some will say, look, the liberal state can't say that a Christian life is the only good life. But it can say, we are going to support Christianity as a state religion for instrumental reasons. Things will work out better. We're not saying Christianity is inherently better than other religions. We're just saying it makes sense for us instrumentally as means to an end to have a state religion, right? Typically, this will be associated with a relatively weak kind of state religion. So most liberals who buy this kind of view will say, you shouldn't tell people they, can't be Jews in a Christian state. But you could have things like how it works in the UK, where, Christian schools can get federal funding, Jewish schools can't. That sort of thing, right? And this is the kind of thing that a lot of people who worry about things like the war on religion in the United States think would be a more reasonable structure than what we have with separation of church and state, right? So most people are not saying, look, you shouldn't be allowed to be a Jew or a Muslim or a Hindu or whatever in the United States. But given that the majority of Americans are Christians, why shouldn't it be that government offices can have the 10 Commandments up on the wall without having to also put, the laws of Hanuman or, whatever else up on the wall next to them? So that's a kind of relatively liberal understanding of having a primacy for a state religion. Yeah, and you may need these things because it makes things more efficient, it gets people to help each other out more, it builds social capital, whatever. And the typical liberal package, right, the typical identity that liberals think it makes sense for the state to promote, if not enforce, is some combination of a common language, right? It's hard to have a community if people can't talk to each other, right? So an expectation, again, not sort of the Turkish model where you punish people for speaking their native language, but something like the Quebecois model, where you encourage people to speak French through social pressures, through things like if you are an immigrant, you have to send your children to French public school instead of to English public school, right? To make sure that everyone has a common language. Building up common history and mythology, right? All the stuff that when I was in elementary school, you learn like the great heroes of America, and you learn a particular kind of history of the United States that tells your story in a way that is tried to make you proud, right? This is the kind of thing that in the United States, people who are against more multicultural teaching really rail about, right? Because they say, no, children should be taught that, George Washington was a great hero, and not have that muddied up with like, he also owned a bunch of slaves, right? Precisely because we need that narrative to bind us together, right? We need to all be thinking, man, I want to exhibit the virtues of a George Washington. We shouldn't be all going, all of this is meaningless and there is no historical narrative, right? Secular ritual. This is things like Christmas as currently celebrated in the United States, right? Most liberals don't want to say we should have a proper state religion, but it's perfectly fine to have things like Christmas as we currently celebrate it, the 4th of July, these kinds of celebrations that bring people together, right? That every American, part of their life story will be watching fireworks on the 4th of July, right? We'll have that all in common, we'll be able to identify with it, that sort of thing. And some kind of civic creed. So this is, again, for most liberals, not a religious creed, but some kind of set of values, precisely ones that support liberalism, right? So a lot of American or Canadian, like Kimlicka theorists who support this kind of view, a kind of liberal nationalist view, will say it makes sense for, us to say, look, maybe tolerance and democracy and freedom and, are values that we can inculcate in our children, right? Traditional liberalism, complete neutrality liberalism, makes it seem as if, you couldn't tell children that freedom is better than non-freedom or tolerance is better than intolerance, right? But liberal nationalists will say no, right? To maintain a liberal political community, you need to basically indoctrinate children in tolerance, right? You may need to make them intolerant of intolerance in order to sort of give them a common creed that will bind the state together. So even liberals will often say that states should engage in nation building. This is quite specifically nation building, not state building. State building is what you do, what we're doing in Afghanistan right now. You're trying to build institutions, get the courts running, get the military running. Nation building is essentially actions the state can take to try to create a common culture in the state. This is at a more cultural, psychological level. What the liberal nationalists and the communitarians agree on is that nations don't just create and sustain themselves. A state that did nothing to bind the political community together will see dissolution. And a lot of people think this is happening in, especially the United States and to some extent in Europe, right? This is the bowling alone problem. Or, the way in the United States a lot of people complain that especially with the internet and with greater geographic segregation, most of us live in relatively small bubble communities where we don't interact with people who have different views, different values, and as a result, there is less and less a common American culture than there used to be. I mean, there's always variation, but it was still the idea that there was variation within an American culture and that is being lost is a concern, especially of communitarians. So the tools of nation building, at least of this kind of liberal nation building, official languages, some influence over education and the media, right? Centralized rules about what schools can, cannot, must not teach, and these sort of civic festivals and obligations. Jury duty, voting, 4th of July, all of these sorts of things. Nation building probably is going to involve assimilating immigrants to some extent. Not necessarily forcibly, but some kind of social deal, right? The melting pot idea that I grew up with, that if you're an immigrant but you come to America, you are expected to assimilate to American culture to some extent. Doesn't mean you can never do anything from your original culture, but the idea is that now you are an American. And it may involve excluding or marginalizing some residents. Kimlicka talks importantly about sort of the extent to which you can have a community, political community, while allowing or requiring some groups to kind of go off on their own, like the Amish. And it does, for better or worse, involve systematically privileging certain elements of the dominant culture. It involves the state saying, the president is going to go light the Christmas tree and maybe the menorah, but the president is not necessarily going to spend his time going to, every Raelian festival or speaking, celebrating every Baha'i holiday. It involves saying most people speak English, or give it 10 years, most people speak Spanish, so government services will be available in that language and not others. If you want to interact with the government, if you want to vote, you want to get a driver's license, you want to do whatever, you need to learn the common language. And this is clearly where people have moral objections to it, is in the way that it privileges elements of whatever the dominant existing culture is in the state. So, concerns about this. One concern on the theoretical level is a lot of liberals say, look, we're not really committed to radical individualism in the way that the communitarians think that we are. What we are committed to, say, these kinds of liberals, Nussbaum among them, is a cosmopolitan identity. We're not committed to the bad idea that everyone is just a complete blank slate, you know, that just chooses stuff from nowhere. No, of course people choose stuff from a position. They're not blank slates. They choose it against a cultural context. What we're actually committed to is fundamentally the creation of a kind of cosmopolitan culture within which cosmopolitan morality makes sense. And what's behind that kind of view, certainly for someone like Nussbaum, is that we're morally obligated to create that culture. If I do not feel the obligations of justice to someone in Bangladesh as keenly as I feel them to someone in Montana, that's a problem with me. I ought to do my best to extend my sympathies. And that this can be an identity, right? This is not a non-identity. That's the naive liberal picture, but non-naive liberals will say this is an identity and an attractive one, right? It's a lot of what Nussbaum is on about. Question about what about minority groups? Assimilation or marginalization are not tremendously attractive options for a lot of minority groups. Similarly for the marginalized and dissidents, right? Especially when you start thinking about things like freedom of conscience, we get hard questions about what should we say about dissidents. There's an impulse to want to solve this problem perhaps by saying, look, there's dissidents and then there's dissidents, right? In the United States context, for instance, think about this with freedom of speech, right? A lot of people would say, well, look, maybe what we should do is allow political debate, right? People to have whatever political positions they want. But, you know, we outlaw hate speech and racism and pornography and that sort of stuff that doesn't contribute properly to the political debate. But other people will say, no, you can't actually make that cut because a lot of the non-dominant perspectives are considered pornographic or hateful, you know, or perverse in some way that would put them outside the bounds of polite society, right? So, you know, gay rights would possibly fall into this kind of problem. Nowadays, we are used to, at least in the United States, of thinking of gay rights as essentially a political thing. And for most people, even if you don't support gay rights, you would think of someone asserting that gays should have the right to marry as a legitimate political position, right? Sort of a core political free speech kind of position. But, you know, not too long ago, that was, you know, be much more likely to be considered obscenity. You know, Canada, which has more restrictive speech laws than the United States, for a long time, it was very hard to get magazines about gay life or gay culture in Canada because they get stopped at the border as obscene, right? As essentially pornography, even if they were not, you know, pornography in the sense that you normally think about it. It was stories about gay life and this sort of thing. You got a question about what to do about states that aren't nation states. What do we say about, you know, Belgium or Canada or potentially the United States? Do we are we morally obligated to break them up? Do they have some, you know, this is basically the problem that while communitarianism can provide a kind of theoretical structure in which nationalism can make sense, it's not clear that communities and nations and states all line up with each other nicely. So does it make sense for Americans to be nationalist or Belgians to be nationalist in the same way that it might make more sense for you know, Ghanaians to be nationalist, right? Where there's arguably a denser kind of community. And this does actually come up in political questions, right? Not too long ago, there was an active debate in the United States about whether in Iraq we should essentially support the breakup of Iraq into 3 smaller states, one primarily Kurdish, and then 2 Arab states, one that was primarily Sunni and one that was primarily Shia. And this is questions about if you accept that states and communities should line up, what do you do about the many actual situations where they do not? And finally, and we'll talk about human rights more, humanitarians' views and even liberal nation-building views raise questions about basic human rights. Most human rights concepts are strongly individualist, strongly cosmopolitan. So there is a question about, it all sounds very nice about how we need to maybe do this to make the political community more cohesive, but when you start saying that, look, somebody can't say what they want to say, somebody can't believe what they want to believe, someone can't, live where they want to live, does that violate human rights that are more fundamental than the value of the state? All right, so to sum up, lots of abstract moral theories seem to imply cosmopolitanism and universalism. The particular contingent connections we have with other people don't seem to make sense within them, right? When you have a moral theory that looks at what the abstract individual ought to do, it's hard to make sense out of the idea that, in some situation where the interests of one nation and another conflict, I ought to promote the interests of America, you ought to promote the interests of China, and both of us are right, right? There's a strong pressure to say, no, we should figure out whose interests are more valid or more legitimate or whatever. But intuitions, our gut level intuitions, don't seem to play nice with that. So, we might at the end of the day say that our gut level intuitions are wrong, but it's at least a lot of pressure to try to resolve that conflict. Liberal nationalists see national culture as playing an instrumental role to holding the state together. They don't think that American culture is in some absolute sense better than Chinese culture or vice versa, but they think that it makes sense for America to promote American culture and China to promote Chinese culture to hold those states together. Communitarians take a stronger view. They see nationalism and political community as tied into the nature of human life. Human morality, meaningful human lives simply don't make sense outside of a communal context. And a lot of them take this to the degree of a form of relativism. So Alistair McIntyre, for instance, would say, it's a complicated, sophisticated form of relativism, but would say, for instance, that for an American, it's perfectly reasonable to say, no, the American way of life is the best, right? Because we judge all moral values against this community. For a Chinese person, it makes sense for them to say, no, the Chinese way of life is the best way of life. And if you ask, well, who's right about that? McIntyre will say, look, either you're asking from inside a cultural context, right? If you're an American, the answer is the Americans are right. If you're a Ghanaian, the answer is neither of them are right. Ghanaian culture is the best culture, right? And if you're trying to ask from outside of any kind of moral framework, McIntyre and folks like him will say, you're making a mistake. There's no answer to the question outside of a moral framework, which culture is, outside of a culture, which culture is the best, right? That's just a meaningless question. But at the end of the day, as a policy matter, whether you are attracted to a kind of liberal nationalism or thoroughgoing liberalism or communitarian nationalism, nations require nation building. They don't just happen spontaneously. So if you think that we need political communities and we need nations, you probably have to accept that states do legitimately intervene to shape the cultural context within them, with all of the moral concerns that raises.